a good handle on the. Yes, okay. Um, we've we've got a good handle on the Godwits, but the red knots are still a bit of a challenge. So we'll see some of that as we go through this talk. Anyway, yeah, so engraved leg flags and what they've taught us. So let's see if this works. Yeah, that'll sort of do it. So tracking individual birds. I mean, if you're trying to learn anything about these birds, then it's important to try and track individuals. And most of you are familiar with the various options. We started with just metal bands back in the 80s. But they, they're quite limited in what they tell you. You've basically got to catch the bird again or hope that somebody finds it and recovers it for you. We started then using plain flags, but they only tell you where, in what part of the sort of flyway the flag was put on. Once you've, we first put those on in 1991. So just a plain white flag on a Godwit will have been put on sometime between, since 1991. Colour bands are also useful. But depending on where they are, to Pocoroco and Miranda, they're not quite so useful because the mud is quite soft and often the bands are buried in the mud or in the shallow water. And then Phil Batley's tried using geolocators, which and Rob Shuckard and Dave Melville in the South Island putting these things on, and they record good information for you as long as you can catch the birds again. And Godwits are very smart birds and don't like being caught twice. So there's an awful lot of them walking around with these little geolocators on them. And of course, the other one, the latest ones are things like satellite tags. And you see that picture there with a little backpack satellite tag, solar powered. They're marvelous, but of course quite expensive. They're not always that reliable. So we to try and get more information, but in a cheap and simple way, we started using the white engraved flags on Godwits knots and turnstones, and that's been very successful. We've put, whether you can see that, we've got these pictures of that, if you can see the knot one. But yes, 1,300 Godwits have had these flags, 1,200 plus knots and 11 turnstones. There's not very many of them, but again, it can be very useful. I'm just going to find how to click on. Here we are. And we're also started using engraved leg flags on New Zealand dotterels, the northern race. And that was really, I've been curious about the ones on the west coast of Auckland. These are the wild west coast beaches, Piha and Kari and Bethels. And over the last 30 or 40 years, they've never seemed to have done very well. In fact, until about 5 or 6 years ago, when the community groups started protecting them, they weren't doing at all well, and maybe only 2 or 3 pairs were successful. But the number wasn't increasing, and I thought, well, if we flag the juveniles, we'll be able to see whether as adults they're recruited to that west coast population. And so far, we've banded them all around other parts of Auckland as well, and particularly on industrial sites. So there's quite a lot of birds. 93 of the 157 have been seen, but so far only 2 of the ones we've banded. We've banded 50 or so on the west coast of Auckland juveniles, just fledglings, and only 2 of those have been recruited to the west coast. The others have all disappeared and are scattered, and some of them are still being seen, but not on the west coast. Anyway, that's a side thing. So as far as the Godwits and knots and so on are concerned, the Arctic migrants, so you can see we're getting quite a decent collection of sightings, 23,700 Godwits and 10,000 red knots. Working out about 89 to 86% of the number we've flagged have been seen at least once. So it is reasonably successful. And who has seen them? Well, so far we've had over 200 people record them, which is very encouraging. And some of them are done from photos, particularly those that are seen in Asia. They tend to take photos. I think quite a few of the people out there don't have binoculars, they just have cameras. and they just take photos, which is particularly good because you guarantee, that the sightings are correct. Tony Harbracken is well known as probably the most obsessive flag searcher, but he's not so good at reporting them to me. I usually get a file about every 2 years with a couple of thousand sightings in it, and it takes me the next couple of years to sort them all out. We haven't had too much trouble, but this was one issue we had with these flags. We've got this sort of growth on them. It was quite bizarre, but otherwise the flags have held up extremely well, and some of them have been on for still visible after 18 years. And for those who are not familiar with the flagging protocol on the East Asian Australasian Flyway, there's the early instigators of this all got a single colour, so yellow, orange, green, blue, and white. The black came in later. But then various other either regions of the countries or new countries wanted to start banding, and so they had to go to the two colour codes. But this has worked extremely well. So sort of just basically people can do what they want, but it works very well, and there doesn't seem to be too many problems with it. The Australians in Victoria use the orange flags. You've got that one there seen there. And Chongmingdao in Shanghai, they've been using a black flag over a white one, and they started off with just 2 digits on their white flags, but then they ran out and wanted to use 3 digits. And so the word goes out to the various banding groups around the flyway. Does anyone have an issue? And so I said, well, because they're using a white flag, if they use 3 letters, then the risk is that people don't see the black flag. We shall get some confusion. And so I suggested that they should use, if their 3-digit code should be at least 1 number and 2 letters, and we only use 3 letters, and that seems to be working well. This is the rarest combination on the flyway. This is an orange over white, engraved white. There's only 7 birds with this combination on, and 6 of them are whimbrels and 1's a Kentish plover. And if anyone ever sees one of these, I'll be more than delighted. So far, they haven't turned up anywhere, but I'd love to see one. There'd be a decent prize for anyone who finds one of those whimbrels. So those are the few that we banded in North Korea. Some years, David and I, a few years ago now. We have had engraved flags from other places also seen in New Zealand. I keep a database on those as well. So from Alaska and Russia or Siberia through Japan, a couple of places in China, and the sort of key way to banding sites around Australia have all sort of a lot of flags. Oh, this is engraved flags, not just colours. There are colours in other places, but they haven't been seen here, or just plain flags don't tell you as much. So what have we found out? Well, this is a classic one. This is, I don't know whether you can see that at the top, but this is AJD that was banded in Foxton Estuary in October 2008 as a 3+-year-old bird. And it has spent the last 16 years going between Foxton and Wanganui estuaries. Tends to turn up the end of each south of migration. It turns up at Foxton, and then around early December it moves up to Wanganui, and it stays there until March the 25th, or close to that date, which is seems to be its preferred migration day. And it's become a bit of a celebrity with Paul Gibson, the local birder there, actually writing or producing a book on it with lots of nice photos of this particular bird. So but interestingly, although a lot of birds have been seen overseas, this one's not been seen anywhere in the whole 16 years. It's been traveling up and down well, we assume it's traveling all the way up to Alaska and back, and it's not just sneaking off and camping up somewhere quietly for our winter. But yeah, so that's a particularly interesting one, and it's still going. It was returned a couple of weeks ago, much celebration by Paul. this is rather a long chart, but it gives you some idea of where our flags are being seen and how much you can learn from it. So Yalujiang is without doubt sort of Godwit central on the flyways. You can see there is a lot of observers working there, but 493 sightings of 245 different birds. And then the rest of China, there's only been 5 birds seen, individuals. South Korea, obviously, quite significant. And no doubt a lot are in North Korea, but there's just not enough people visiting there to, in fact, there's only a small group that's ever seen any there. And not so many in Japan, but there are quite a lot of birders there or photographers, but clearly it's not such an important area for our birds. And the Taiwan one, the little dot on the map, doesn't appear to be in Taiwan, but Taiwan has a tiny bit of land on the coast of mainland China, and that's where one has been seen. Queensland and New South Wales, these are mostly during southward migration where these are seen. Well, in fact, they're all during southward migration. We'll come back to them in a little while. And then Alaska and Russia. So our Godwits are basically all going to Alaska. And so that's where we obviously expect to go to Alaska rather than Russia. What have we got? This is another interesting one. The Victorians are using orange flags on their Godwits or on all their waders. And this one's particularly interesting because there's been 318 different birds sighted in New Zealand. The engraved flags from Victoria, 2,300 plus records. And so it's interesting to see what the return rate is for white flags going to Victoria. And so far, it's none and none. So they're just not going. White flags either aren't going to Victoria, or the Victorians aren't looking for them. And the jury's out on that one. They do spend more time catching birds there than looking for their flags. But it's interesting that these birds, and it does appear most of those 318 were banded in Victoria as 1 or 2 year old birds. So they do seem to make their way from Alaska to there to start with. And then they move across to New Zealand, and then they don't, almost very few of them ever appear to go back to Victoria or anywhere else in Australia on a regular basis anyway. There are 1 or 2 records of this happening, but not too many. So the Queenslanders in southeast Queensland, they're using green flags, and we've got 60 of their birds. Is it 60? I've hidden behind the screen here. 62 of their birds have been seen here. 568 sightings of them, and our birds seen there. Only 29 of our birds white flags have been seen in southeast Queensland. But again, this is probably, even those 62 from southeast Queensland, are probably more likely they were New Zealand birds, but during their southward migration, as we now know from satellite tagging, some birds get pushed by conditions where the conditions during their migration end up in Queensland and New South Wales before returning back to New Zealand. And so probably most of those 62 and obviously our 29 are regular New Zealand birds, but of course with the green flag, they're considered to be Australian. So if we do catch any of those, we immediately change the flag to a white one so that they get the true colour they deserve. So I've got a few little case studies here of individual birds. With so many, with 1,300 Godwits, there's an awful lot of stories that you can be told from that. But we'll just go through a couple of. So this is a good example of where a metal band doesn't tell you very much. This bird was banded in 1993 as a 3+ year old bird, but we never knew anything about it until January 2012. So 19 years before, we had no idea that this bird still existed when we recaptured it. So we then put a leg flag on it and were able to follow it from then until presumably its demise. And it was seen once in Alphedo, which is in South Korea, in 2014, and it hasn't been seen since 2017. Interesting, it's potentially done sort of 700,000 K on migration. So by the time it had done that, it probably was worn out. This is another interesting one that that's been going to the same place in South Korea where for several years, and you can see on the screen here it's the number of days between when it was last seen in New Zealand in these years and the days before, you know, the number of days before it was then seen in South Korea. So 13 days, those 2 years, 15 days. And that was just, it was last seen in the February and didn't turn up for 85 days. But these 13 and 15 day ones were very interesting. And in the early days, this was helping us to indicate before the satellite tags that these birds were flying non-stop up to Asia, because that's, you know, in that short time. Potential sighting of that in September this year back at Miranda, but because it hadn't been seen for 6 years, I'm a bit dubious of that. It may be a misread, and I'll hopefully get another one this summer. So when I record these, although I do record them, even though it looks, you know, suspicious that it hasn't been seen for 6 years, I do keep them on record. But you know, wait hopefully to see another sighting of it. One of the concerns is whether catching them close to migration is an issue. And this is a good example. It may be for some birds, but this one we caught on 30th of March, 3+ bird. It was still seen at Foxton 4 or 5 days later, and then 9 days after that, it was in South Korea. A very good example of one that wasn't too put out by us capturing it. Useful to know that sort of thing. One of the other things we're looking for, apart from the sort of migration strategies, but is how site faithful are these birds or not, as the case may be. So we've had about 45% of all the Godwit we've flagged have only been seen at the site of the flagging site, but there's another 250 that have been seen overseas and at the flagging site. So that basically comes out of about 70% of all the birds are pretty site faithful to their banding site. The juveniles are quite a different story. We've banded 160 or flagged 164. Only about half of those have actually been seen again. And interestingly, we've done quite a few of those at Foxton, and we banded them on one day, then gone out the next morning to look for them, and they've all vanished. We'll see an example of that. So only 27 have been seen at the same site. So it's only about 16% on this basis are site faithful. So it's quite different to the adults. And we now know from satellite tagging as well that that the young Godwits do tend to wander around the country looking for a place to call home. And then they settle down and appear to then make that their preferred site. Another thing we're looking at, and I'd love somebody to come along and help me, who's good at number crunching, and give me some help on how to sort of use this data better to look at the age structure. But of the 1,300 birds, 426 have made it to at least 10 years old, and then 126 of those have gone on to become 15, and so on down to one bird has now reached 28 years, which is the oldest one we know of in this part of the world. So that's quite a good one. So if anybody out there who has a better idea of or knows someone who's good at number crunching, I'd love to find out more about how we could use that data to look at their age structure. This was an example of one of those birds that we banded as a juvenile at Foxton in October, on the 26th of October 2008. We looked for it on the next day, and it was not seen. In fact, it wasn't seen again. until January of 2011, when it turned up on Pawnui Beach on the Coromandel. And that is obviously where it had decided to stop and stay as an adult, but it hasn't been seen there since 2015. But a good example of one that moved around looking for somewhere and then settled on Pawnui Beach. Obviously had plenty of money, that one. Just looking at some of the orange ones, just for a matter of interest, there's one that a lot of them are bounded at Corner Inlet over in Victoria. This was aged 1, again, one that moved across to New Zealand and was seen regularly on the Kaipara between 2011 and 16. And then it was seen back at Corner Inlet. It's one of the few that have been seen back there, and that was in 2012 by myself, who I made a point of trying to get to Corner Inlet to look for flags as opposed to going there to catch birds, and it was quite productive. And then it's been, and that one particularly was then seen again 17 days later on the Kaipara. So that was one that obviously went back on that south of migration, went back to Victoria, but didn't stay there and moved back over to New Zealand again. But there's only a couple of those that have done that we know of. This AU was another interesting one, banded in Victoria but moved to New Zealand. First seen banded there in 2010, first seen here in 2013, and then we're seen on a regular basis at Omaha, up on north of Auckland, but it was also then seen up in Awhido in South Korea. And they, again, you can see some of these, the number of days between the last sighting in New Zealand and the first sighting up in South Korea. So very nice sequence of dates there. And just as a little bonus, the two people that were keeping those records. So Marie was looking at the Omaha birds and Andreas Kim was looking at the ones in South Korea. So they got together down at Miranda one day, which was rather nice. So we should move on to red knots. This has been far more of a challenge to understand what these birds are up to. So again, we've banded quite a few. The Bohai Sea in the sort of western part of the Yellow Sea complex is the central, is red knot central, and there's been 1,300 sightings of 464 of our birds seen there, which is out of the 1,220 that we've flagged. So a good chunk of them are seen in that place. Siberia, there's 14 sightings of 4 birds. This equates to Pavel Tonkovic working with them up there, and we'll see that again in a minute. Yalujiang, which is, you know, hugely important for Bartail Godwits, sees very few red knots. So even to get 2 sightings of 2 birds there is quite remarkable. A lot of our birds do go through Chongmingdao, but near Shanghai, but and some birds have been recovered, but I've only had the 4 flagged birds seen there. One from South Korea. Taiwan is a staging spot for some of the birds, and two birds seen in the Gulf of Carpentaria. We're pretty sure an awful lot more birds go through there, but we'll come to that one in a few minutes. So the Bohai Bay is really where most of the red knots that we know of are refueling. Part of why the reason we were wanted to go to North Korea was that back in the day, the estimated population of red knots couldn't be accounted for in the Yellow Sea during migration, and so we had to think, well, where are they if we can't find them all? So that were they in North Korea? So that's what we hung our hopes on, was getting to North Korea to find red knots. You know, find the missing 100,000. Well, we didn't find, after 6 field trips there, we managed to find 42. So they don't go to North Korea. Or they were certainly nowhere we've been, and we've been to most of the coast now. But then it was decided that the population estimate was wrong, and there weren't as many as was first thought. Another bird that's been struggling, of course. But during the south of migration, a lot more are being seen in in Australia, but none so far in Asia. So the possibility is that a lot of them are flying from remote parts of Russia all the way down to northern Australia and are missing out on the Yellow Sea completely on their way south. Or at least, we've had no sightings from there. But New South Wales and Southeast Queensland, a lot of the birds are coming back through there and staging those areas before moving back to New Zealand. So and there's some, good people searching for them during that southward period. We've had a couple of our birds seen in northwest Australia, and actually three red knots in Victoria. The northwest Australia thing is a little bit different in that we've had 2 of our white flags seen there, we've had 57 of their yellow engraved flags seen in New Zealand. And these are the subspecies of Piersmai, which nests up on the New Siberian Islands, up on the top of the map there. And it wasn't thought that we sort of got them in any number coming to New Zealand, but the more we've sort of learned about them, the more they have a much darker red plumage in the breeding season. And so in the breeding season, or prior to them departing, we can actually detect more of them. So there seems to be more of the Piersmai getting to New Zealand, whereas their stronghold is northwest Australia. Orange flags, red knots. So 148 of theirs from Victoria have come over to here. And again, only 3 of our birds have been seen over there, and all those were from Foxton. And we do know that juveniles in particular, juvenile knots tended to, well, in the past certainly, tended to go to Victoria more than, and then come across to New Zealand. And I mean, we've caught very few juvenile red knots in the last 30 odd years, but Victoria was always catching big numbers of them. So we think a lot of those were doing that trip down to Victoria as juveniles, then coming to New Zealand, and then not going back to Australia again. They've just become New Zealand birds after that. This is one that has got a geolocator on its leg and has been flitting around up and down to the Bohai, been seen at Foxton and at Pukorokoro and Miranda, but we haven't been able to catch it again. So its geolocator is still on the bird, or it hasn't been seen since 2022, so it may not be with us anymore. But there's an interesting one. So although these geolocators can tell you a lot of information, you still have to catch it first. I talked a little bit about the Gulf of Carpentaria. This is very few people go there. It's a very remote part of Australia. I've got a map there. So in the Queensland, northern Queensland, there's only one road to the coast along sort of 700 or 800 kilometers of the coast. Very difficult to access. You need light planes, helicopters, and boats to some extent. But the tides are very weird. They only have one tide a day. And so for some months, the high tides tend to be at night, and so you can't see the birds anyway. And all the low tides are during the day when the birds are scattered. So I've been on 2 expeditions to that area, and we have certainly seen red knots along with all the other species. And there's a few examples of ones, vast mudflats, so even getting any sightings is a challenge. But here, there's a few here I'm going to show you. AXY, seen in the Gulf in September. So this is a bird coming back south and stopping in the Gulf of Carpentaria. Possibly quite a lot to stop there. There's just no observers there. It's too difficult to work. So that was seen a few times. And this one was seen in the Bohai regularly between 2009 and 13. And in between, it was seen back here in New Zealand. And then in March 2013, it was seen up in the Gulf. And March 2013 was the last time a real survey was done of the on land of the Gulf of Carpentaria. Been some aerial surveys since then, but not much in the way of on ground ones. There is a hope to get back there. Small team of us should get there in March next year to do the same, do another big search of the area, spend a month there counting and looking for birds with flags and so on. Another one here, seen in the Gulf in the September 2012, and then back in January here. So that one was moving through. Prior to the big expedition, the month-long expedition in March 2013, Peter Driscoll and I flew up there in September 2012 to do a recce and to sort out accommodation and helicopters and that sort of thing. And so we were able to do a little bit of field work and got some good results from that. Another one, this one mostly seen in the Manukau and also in the Bohai in China, and then back in Newcastle, and then in 2011 in October, and then moving over in New South Wales, and then slipping back across to here. And that one was seen on us. There was a short expedition in 2016 to the Gulf, and that was seen then. So the Gulf is probably much more important than we know. It's just we don't get enough chance to look there. And just to add a little bit, with some white flags that are put on red knots on Monya Pilgano in Siberia by Pavel Tonkovich. This goes back some years, back to about 2011, when Pavel was struggling to to get flags to put on the birds, and so I sent him some just to get him out of out of strife for that year, and so he's been using our white flags ever since. But they come with a small lime green flag as well, and that's been very useful. So some very valuable information come out of that one. This one, CKT, was banded on the breeding grounds and was seen on the Manukau Harbour, on the Kuiper Harbour and the Manukau. And then in 2017, it teamed up with another bird, which Pavel caught, and that one with had DAW added to it, and that one was seen that same year back at Pecora Miranda. So that's a little side issue. There's some really valuable information coming out of, and that was one of our flag birds was seen on the nest there some years ago now. That was very satisfying to have one of our birds actually found on a nest. And this is catching the birds and banding the chicks. The adults don't seem too concerned with maybe it's the camouflage clothing. They can't see it, can't see the guy, but you could enlargement of the chick. So amazingly well camouflaged in that sort of tundra. And finally, onto the turnstones. We haven't had a lot of, we only put 11 on those, and only one of those has been seen outside, away from the banding area. They have all been seen at least once, but this one has turned up in South Korea again. Andreas Kim, the person you saw earlier, has seen this one up in Mokpo over three years up there, which is really in exactly the same place. So there's still a lot to learn about red knots, but anyway, a big thank you especially to the Pecora Miranda Naturalist Trust, because they basically support all the banding work we do, and of course to all the observers sending in their records. And if you have any of those in your notebooks, please send them to someone, preferably me. So thank you. Any questions?
Mute. That was brilliant. If you have a question, could you unmute yourself?
Silence.
Silence. Have you any concerns about bird flu coming with your birds, Adrian?
Yes, of course. The chances of them bringing it are pretty slim, because most of them are flying a very long way. Well, particularly the Godwits coming all the way from Alaska to New Zealand. So if they've got a seriously, a heavy load of that virus, then they're unlikely, it's going to kill them. It's unlikely they'll get to New Zealand, even if they had it when they left Alaska. And although some of our birds, the red knots are coming through from Australia, so there's a potential to pick it up there. But it's more likely that we're going to get it via the seabirds, I think, than these birds. But yeah, I mean, we're very conscious of the risk, for sure. Yeah.
Right. Asked to unmute. Oh, Richard, is it? Where do I find Richard?
Hello. Thank you so much. That was excellent. I was curious, is the data that you have publicly available anywhere on how these birds have moved?
I write short articles on, for the Bucora Miranda News from time to time. I have been keen to write a sort of more interesting, or a paper on it, but it's actually turns out it's quite hard to do something meaningful, in a scientific way. I mean, it's in